roadblocks, lock-ons and public confrontation, young people across the UK are putting their bodies on the line to force attention onto the issues that matter to them. Meanwhile, the UK government is clamping down on protests it considers disruptive and antisocial, with new rules and harsher consequences. Welcome to Generation Change, a global series that attempts to understand and challenge the ideas that mobilise youth around the world. Today we meet two activists who use different methods to push and lobby for change. Whether it's direct action or engaging with the political system, they campaign on issues ranging from the climate emergency to migrant rights and the global arms trade. So Fatima, you were born in Canada to Somali parents, but you grew up here in London. What planted the seed of activism for you?
What planted the seed for me was growing up in the early 2000s in the backdrop of the Iraq War. Everywhere you looked, the media was talking about Muslims and talking about people that looked like me. And I think that filled me with a lot of anger and kind of confusion. And I became quite obsessed with politics. If I didn't engage in it, politics was definitely engaging with me and my identity and setting the terms, and I didn't want that to happen.
I think people are familiar with the term climate crisis or climate emergency, but you've spoken about climate justice. What do you mean when you talk about that?
For a long time, we've talked about climate change as an environmental issue, right? But climate change is a symptom of a system that's breaking down and not working and responsible for a lot of other injustices. So whether we're talking about racial injustice, whether we're talking about the housing crisis or inequality, at the heart of it is an economy that prioritizes profit and profit for the few, and then is plundering people and planet. So we have the same companies who are responsible for the vast majority of emissions are also responsible for poor working conditions and low wages. They're also responsible for not paying taxes. And who has to pick up the bill? People. So when we talk about climate justice, we talk about building a hopeful vision of the future that means we can tackle other social injustices in the pursuit of tackling climate change.
A lot of people would say that there are many climate movements at the moment which are fighting against the climate crisis. So where did you see a gap for your organisation, Green New Deal Rising?
In G&D Rising, we have embedded an analysis of things that the climate movement hasn't necessarily gotten right. One of them is the climate movement for a long time has been white and middle class. And we all know in order to beat something as big as climate change, we need everyone. And so how do we include everyone? What if we built an economy that's only priority was to serve people and planet? We would have an economy that invested in communities, that built wealth for communities, that lived within planetary boundaries because we're investing in renewables and public transport. And that's what we're doing at Green New Deal Rising is we're talking about the Green New Deal, which is an economic transformation that allows us to thrive in the future and tackle climate change. The other thing that's super different about what we're doing is we're political. Our main tactic is to find MPs and hold them accountable and to challenge them and to film them so that we have them on record. And when we put them online, you know, it's up to the electorate to decide whether these people are for us and against us. There's not much in that suitcase, is there?
You like to come,
Where's the climate finance, Rishi? One of our most popular challenges is when we challenge Priti Patel, the former Home Secretary, who's passing the plan to kind of offshore refugees and migrants to Rwanda for processing. And we went to a fundraising dinner she was hosting and disrupted that engagement.
Priti Patel, as a young person who wants to live in a fair and compassionate society.
And actually it went viral, and I think a lot of people looked at it and asked themselves, why are climate activists talking about migration? Things like the Rwanda plan are just a distraction to get us to be angry at migrants, people who just want better lives and opportunities, instead of being angry at a political class that is just taking more and more from working people and giving us less in return.
Huda, your dad is Palestinian, your mum is Iraqi, but you were born and bred in the UK. How did your family story and background shape your worldview?
Well, for my family, we were actually the only ones from both sides of the family to ever come to a Western country. So most of my dad's family were living in Jordan or in exile, and all of my mum's family were living in Iraq. So when you grow up here with that kind of background, it's very difficult to not be politically aware.
As a young person, what was your first kind of experience of activism and doing the type of work that you do?
So I was researching into my university, and I set up a boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign and got many students and academics on board. And then later went on to replicate this at other universities. And this really laid the foundations for what later was formed as Palestine Action.
Can you tell me a little bit about Palestine Action and what led you to want to start it?
So Palestine Action is a direct action network, and our main focus and our main target is Elbit Systems, which is Israel's largest arms firm. And specifically, it was started because all other avenues to bring an arms embargo between Britain and Israel had failed, including through the political process, through Labour specifically, which I was involved in. And when every other route fails, then direct action was the route left open for us. So we started off by initially storming into their headquarters in London, spray painting across their offices, and kept going back again and again. And eventually more and more people joined our network. So one of their massive factories in Oldham was forced to sell at a massive loss, and they were forced to abandon their London headquarters. So for us, we want to continue to grow this movement until all of Elbit sites are shut down in this country.
Can you explain why you've chosen to focus on Elbit Systems?
They produce the vast majority of Israel's military drone fleet, and we've seen how this is used on the captive population of Gaza routinely. They market them as battle-tested or combat-proven, and then use that to sell it on to other regimes across the world. They've been used against the people of Kashmir, for example, Iraq, Afghanistan, and many other places, also against refugees here who are trying to seek safety in this country. They also build the electronics for the apartheid wall. The same system is being used between US and Mexico, so we can see how it starts off in Palestine and then is used against other people across the world.
Can you explain exactly what risks you run yourself in order to carry this out?
We were quite heavily targeted, I think, at the start of Palestine Action, and we saw that followed up by raids on our homes for the co-founders, including arresting Richard Barnard, another co-founder, for blackmail. And this was after he said that he would go on hunger strike if the landlords did not evict Elbit. They did continue to charge several of us with that. So we're facing charges of blackmail, conspiracy to commit criminal damage, and conspiracy to burgle.
So getting arrested is kind of part of the plan?
It's not the end of the process for us. Actually, the court process in itself is an extension of the action, and it's where we can try and force this company to basically give out information that they would not normally give out.
But you are running a real risk, and are you not scared of going to prison?
If this continues to operate, more and more lives are going to be taken, and so I'm more than willing to accept prison as a consequence. I will still be a lot better off than most people who are at the end of these weapons.
To kick things off, I just want to ask, in the UK, we've gone through so many big changes. Do you think that young people are disillusioned, or do you think they are politically engaged and active? What's your opinion at the moment?
I think both. I think young people are disillusioned, and I'm one of them. But we are also political. I think we're in this period where actually social activism and social movements have never been more active and imaginative. But it's the political elite and, electoral politics that I think is what's disillusioning young people, because we have an electoral system and a voting system that A, is not representative, but also most people want bold action. They want their economy to work for them and their communities. They want action on climate change. They want investment in our public services. The only reason we survived the pandemic were because of frontline service workers. I thought we all agreed during the pandemic that those are the people that should be at the heart of our communities. They are the people that we should be investing in. And the only reason it's bold action is because we still have in place political leaders who somehow haven't caught up with the consensus.
The fact is that many young people are disillusioned with the political system, but I think are way more political than ever before, because the political system and the electoral politics has failed so many people. And I think the situation with Corbyn in Labour brought on a lot of young people into party politics, and they felt like that was a vehicle for change. And when that didn't work, for myself at least, it opened my eyes to realising that we cannot afford to invest our time into a system that wasn't designed for us. But that doesn't mean that there isn't ways that we can be politically active and change our society through the grassroots, rather than through appealing to the powers that be to create those changes for us.
I mean, I would say that I don't see social movements being successful unless they have a political wing. So it's not about wholesale giving up on electoralism or politics. It's about trying to use the power of social movements from the grassroots to kind of force that change. And we see it happening around the world. Actually, in Latin America, we're seeing the hopes of that sort of political wing of progressive politics starting to take power. You know, if you look at Chile, for example, and while we had that defeat in 2019 with Corbyn's Labour, I do see, you know, I'm pragmatic enough to see that there is another way into power. We just need to build stronger movements.
I think for climate change, it may be slightly different. And you're right, you do need a complete overhaul of the system, which will require the state and the government to get behind it. But I think when it comes to anti-imperialism and politics in support of the Palestinian people, then Jeremy Corbyn was an exception, I believe, for what we've had for the past 100 years of successive governments. And no politician in this country has ever shut down an arms factory, whereas people have.
Both of your movements are quite young. They were founded around 2019, which was just before the global pandemic. And then, you know, we've had the war in Ukraine. When you look at all of those issues on the outside, how do you think they've impacted your work and what you're trying to achieve?
So we started at an interesting time. In 2019, it was a time where it was kind of the kind of activism around climate change I don't think I've ever seen before. You had, you know, Extinction Rebellion, you had the climate strikers, you had the UK announcing the first sort of net zero target by 2050 in the world. And then early in 2020, a pandemic came. People were suddenly talking about government intervention. We're talking about investment instead of austerity. We're talking about building back better and not going back to the economy pre-pandemic. And coming out of the pandemic, we had the Ukraine war, which put stressors across Europe, particularly on energy supply. And what we saw was the UK announced new North Sea oil and gas. And that's put us in a really difficult position, because investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure doesn't help us meet our energy needs now, and it doesn't lower energy bills, but it also just puts us in perpetual crisis, because the climate crisis is not going anywhere.
Huda, how do you feel about all of the big events that have happened in recent years and how that's directly impacting what you're doing?
Yeah, so for some context, we launched at the end of July 2020, and then in May 2021, this is when we saw a brutal assault on the people of Gaza, people being forced out of their homes in Jerusalem, and we saw a massive increase in people following and joining Palestine Action and supporting the cause during that time. There was a factory, and 4 activists had climbed onto the top of the roof of that factory in Leicester. And within a couple of hours, hundreds from the local community came out to support those activists. And then we saw the fire service pull out and refuse and say to the police that we will not remove these protesters. So for us, it was about going straight to these arms companies, specifically Elbit Systems, and bypassing the political process. And that strategy also exposed the fact that this company exists here, because Many arms companies, they kind of hide in plain sight in these factories, in industrial towns, that you wouldn't know what the difference was between that one and the one next door, which builds toys for children. And we found it to be extremely successful, whereas before we had never seen that type of success in forcing the closure of Israeli arms factories in this country.
2022 saw people across the UK facing soaring inflation and a rapidly rising cost of living crisis that sparked protests and strikes in one industry after another.
What do we want?
From postal and transport workers to dockers and lawyers. So I want to know what both of you think about how far it is that you should be able to go in terms of getting your point across.
I think it's different for different movements. So for the train strikes, that is their bread and butter. So in order for them to gain their rights and their salary, the rights that they deserve as workers, then it's necessary for them to disrupt the train line. I think Palestine Action is quite different, though, towards Extinction Rebellion's tactics, mainly because Extinction Rebellion is more focused on disrupting the public as a whole as a way of forcing pressure on the government in order to enact the radical change it needs on the climate. Whereas for us, we are more focused on directly disrupting the arms companies which are producing weapons. So there is less impact on the public. However,
I would just add that arguably Palestine Action goes a step further than Extinction Rebellion, smashing up conference rooms, causing damage to the property. So how do you justify that?
Well, when we're smashing up an arms company, we're stopping their ability to produce weapons. And I think many people would agree that you cannot put a price on one human life, yet you can put a price on a window or a factory or a roof, for example, and that should never come at the cost of human life. If you saw a child or just a human being about to be hurt and you had to knock down a door in order to help them, you'd knock that door down without hesitation. And that's exactly the same principle.
Do you have anything that you would add?
Yeah, absolutely. I am a student of social movements, and we often are taught a whitewashed version of whether it's Martin Luther King or Gandhi or the women's rights movements. Huge parts of those movements took direct action that really did stop daily life going on for people or politicians. And so we're going to need movements that take a variety of different actions. And the fact that we're in a day and age where we think striking, workers removing their labor as being extreme, well, who said we have a right over their labor, right? If we're not creating conditions that are fair for them to work in, why should they not down their tools? And so I've been really inspired to see the union leaders that have been on our televisions articulating the fears and hopes of ordinary working people.
In 2022, the UK government brought in legislation to combat what it views as disruptive protest. Now, a new public order bill going through Parliament wants to introduce even harsher rules.
We will also increase the maximum penalties for disrupting a motorway, criminalise interference with key infrastructure such as roads, railways, and our free press, and give the police and the courts new powers.
It's not a human right to vandalise property. It's not my freedom of expression to protest violently. No, you can't just start a riot or glue yourself to the roads and get away with it.
Critics call these measures a threat to long-standing democratic freedoms. The government says they are needed because recent protests by a minority of activists have been dangerous, draining public funds and diverting police resources. What do you think about these new laws and bills and the effect they'll have? And do you think it will impact the way you move forward?
I think people in Britain for a long time used to think authoritarianism was the domain of certain countries, when actually, Britain has exercised it around the world for a long time, and now it's here at home and trying to curtail protest. On one side, it shows that we're being impactful because actually the government is needing to legislate on specific types of protests. On the other hand, I think a lot of people are worried. I've just seen in spaces when we're talking about protests and thinking about the type of actions that we are planning, these bills factor in. They factor into who's willing to take these actions. It isn't an incredibly hostile moment for our movements, but this is the moment we can't let them win, because it becomes the new norm, and then therefore we're unable to sort of claw back any rights if we let that become something that's accepted.
Huda, you're running those risks already. You're running the risk of being sent to prison. How do you feel about all of this happening?
Because a lot of our tactics are already based around direct action and we're already criminalised, the new bills don't affect us that much. But actually, the more they try and repress and put on new laws and new bills, I think the more people will actually move towards more radical types of actions. We saw recently at the anti-monarchy protests, people getting arrested for just shouting slogans, like who elected them? If you can face arrest for that, then why not get arrested for shutting down an arms company? I think that what they've done is going to end up backlashing and help our movements work.
The government says that these bills are necessary because guerrilla tactics used by a small minority of protesters have caused a disproportionate impact on the hard-working majority seeking to go about their everyday lives. What do you make of that argument?
We looked at it through the breakdown of the climate, and in order to get the message across, they're forced into a situation where they're forced into blocking the general public, then it's for the greater good. I think when people take more drastic action, it's in response, and rather than blaming those activists, we have to blame the government who didn't act first.
Just to kind of illuminate a bit more, we did an action over the summer where we disrupted the hustings of the Conservative Party, who were trying to choose their new leader. And I disrupted the speech of Liz Truss.
Liz Truss, you should be ashamed of yourself. You're even ordinary
Her reaction in that moment, as I was being dragged away, was,
I will make sure that militant activists, such as Extinction Rebellion, are not able to disrupt ordinary people who work hard and do the right thing and go into work.
They want to create a situation where the government of the day decides what they think is fair, what they like, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. Democratic societies don't work like that. Democratic societies are one that allow for there to be debate, that allow for people to have different opinions, for people to organize and help determine their futures. And we're slowly sort of walking away from that kind of society and into one that's governed by a few.
If you could take a step back and imagine the world that you want to see, what is it that you want to see the future looking like?
In the UK, I want a future where we, have a sort of democratic renaissance and people are able to be involved in decision-making, and that decisions as a society are based on what benefit people and benefit planet over profit. You know, with the timeline of climate change, whilst it's scary, I think we have opportunity in this window to make sure that the way that we tackle the climate crisis is one that has justice at its heart. But there is a risk, right? I think governments will find a way to tackle climate change, but it's not secure that they're going to do it in a way that's fair. I think everyone now believes climate change exists in the mainstream. The fight is over how we tackle it, and we want to make sure we tackle it in a way that protects our communities.
And what about you, Huda? I mean, your future might involve time in prison, but if you were going to imagine that the efforts you put were going to pay off, how would it look?
Well, I think the obvious first one would be an end to Israel's arms trade in Britain. I don't think many people are aware that we're one of the world's largest exporter of arms, and we're a tiny island. And so much roots back to here. So I think there has to be a massive overhaul of that whole industry, and for that kind of thinking and tactics to be transported to other countries. And then I believe, you know, hopefully within our lifetime, we can see a free Palestine. But for that to happen, we need sanctions, and the governments aren't going to do it, so the people have to do it themselves.
Huda, Fatima, thank you so much for speaking with me today.